morning, Richmond Hill, and welcome to the virtual celebration of the Ward 4 Maple Syrup Festival hosted by Councillor David West. My name is Andrew Caldana, and I'm an event coordinator for the City of Richmond Hill, and I've had the great pleasure of working with Councillor West and the committee on this year's festival. I just want to take a moment to identify the festival partners and sponsors for this morning. Thank you to our sponsors, the JKO Planning Services, JG Cordone Investment Limited, and Garden Homes, and of course to our partners, the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, the TRCA, and the Richmond Hill Historical Society. As you can see on the agenda being shared, we have a very educational and interactive morning planned for you all. Now, before Councillor West takes over, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items and some Zoom etiquette. If you haven't already done so, we strongly encourage you to visit Councillor West's website. It's davidwest-richmondhill.ca/Maple Syrup Festival. Now, leading up to today's virtual celebration, we've created and posted a lot of great content for you to participate in and learn all you need to know about maple syrup. We encourage you to participate in the scavenger hunt to win a sweet prize and take advantage of the weather if you haven't already done so, and take a selfie next to a sugar maple tree and share it with us on social using the hashtag W4MSF for Ward 4 Maple Syrup Festival, and tag at David West RH for your chance to win another great prize. You can visit the Resource Center to learn some interesting maple syrup facts and download and try some delicious maple themed recipes. There's lots to check out. Now, from an etiquette standpoint, you'll notice that the chat feature is disabled, but we strongly encourage you to submit questions for the TRCA presentation portions. There is a Q&A button that you guys can see at the bottom of your screen potentially, or the top of your screen, but we do encourage you to submit some questions for the TRCA portions of today's presentations. Now, should you get disconnected at any time, we strongly encourage you to have your registration link handy to log back in. Now, at this point in time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn it over to Councillor West to get us started. Councillor, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Good morning, Richmond Hill. So I don't know about everybody else, but spring has always been my favorite time of the year. And I think probably this year more than ever, I think we really deserve spring, and the weather later today looks really great. So after this webinar, I hope everybody can get out and enjoy the spring. So one of the things in my family for many generations, probably the surest sign of spring is the flowing of sap and maple syrup. And so I'm really pleased to welcome everybody to the 5th annual Richmond Hill Ward 4 Maple Syrup Festival. And I really appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to tune in and come together as a community, although we are alone in our homes, but we are together as a community and celebrating this uniquely Canadian aspect of spring. So before we start today, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. I'd like to start by acknowledging that Richmond Hill is on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, whose presence continues to this day. We would like to acknowledge the land we are on is at the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the First Nations of the Williams Treaty. We would like to thank them and other Indigenous people for sharing this land with us. We acknowledge this land and the people because the first step in reconciliation is recognizing the existence of Indigenous people. A shared understanding of how our collective past has brought us to where we are today will help us walk into a better future. So I have to be honest, every year, except this year, we've been out in the maple sugar bush in Twickenham Park. And, we're together at that time watching the sap flow out of the trees. I mean, this year, we're obviously not able to do that. And like so many events, we've gone to a virtual format to keep the tradition alive. So I brought this festival to Richmond Hill a number of years ago. And as I said, this is the 5th annual version of it. I think it's important to keep that tradition alive. And I still really do believe that maple syrup is probably one of the best excuses to bring the community together to celebrate spring in a very Canadian way. As I said before, in my mind, maple syrup is probably the very first sign of spring. The sap starts flowing quietly without us maybe even noticing as the days start getting longer and the temperatures start to creep up. And even before the grass starts to show, the trees are busy doing their thing, at least the maple trees. This has been a tradition in my family, as I mentioned, for years. My great-grandfather and grandfather and father all made maple syrup in a farm that they lived on in Northern Ontario. So I'm continuing it as a hobby on a personal level, and I'm really pleased to be able to share that with the community. So without further ado, I'm very honored to have Elder Wabigoon joining us today to start us off in a good way. And I'd like to introduce Elder Wabigoon to all of the attendees today. Elder Wabigoon is an Ojibwe elder. She is a member of the Lac Seul First Nation and sits with the Loon clan. She was born in Sioux Lookout, Ontario, and she is a keeper of sacred pipes, an active community member, a speaker, a land defender, and a water protector. Elder Wabigoon is a 60s scoop survivor, her mother a residential school survivor, and her grandmother a medicine woman. Both women were of the Sape and Petawawe lineage. Elder Wabigoon, always by water, learned about her heritage and now follows her traditional ways. Recently, Elder Wabigoon accepted the inaugural First Peoples Leadership Advisory to the Dean at the Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto. Elder Wabigoon is a co-founder, co-lead, and elder at the Nikibi Dawadina Gigwag University of Toronto Access Program that works with Indigenous youth to reconnect their spirit to the land and the water through land-based teachings, ceremonies, and green infrastructure. Elder Wabigoon has been honored at High Table Massey College at the University of Toronto for her community work, and Nikibi Dawadina Gigwag. She presented her youth program to the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects in British Columbia and has been quoted in the CSLA publication Landscapes and Passages Reconciliation Edition. She has been awarded for her strong commitment to educating the community. Never far from water, Elder Wabigoon leads sunrise water ceremonies and gatherings by the fire to hold space for those who want to listen and share about sacred ceremony, land, and water. She leads open ceremonies, sings and drums for major Toronto events, Ontario College of Art and Design, University Convocation at Roy Thompson Hall, and the landmark Shanandeedwat Indigenous Opera world premiere in Toronto, to name two. In her spare time, Elder Wabigoon enjoys writing, painting, singing, drumming, and spending time with her husband of 23 years, Carl, who's also a knowledge keeper of the Eastern Door Laoon Nation Lynx clan. So before we begin, I would like to offer a pouch of tobacco to Elder Wabigoon. Last month, as a part of our initial request for her participation, we did the same. And I would like to ask Chimigwich, Elder Wabigoon, I would like to offer you this tobacco to show my gratitude for you joining us today and sharing your voice. We are thankful and look forward to receiving your wise words. Please accept this gift of gratitude on the opening and closing remarks of our virtual Ward 4 Maple Syrup Festival. Chimigwich.
Miigwech. Oh, miigwech. Miigwech, David. So, bonjour in the way Maganadog. Anin.
Well, thank you very much, Elder Wabigoon. It really is an honor, and I'm so pleased to have been able to have an opportunity and all of us listening today for your wise words. I always enjoy hearing elders like yourself speaking. There is so much that we should be learning, and it's a journey, but every step is one step closer to the destination, I suppose. So thank you, Chimigwich, for your words, and you will be back later on to close our ceremony. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentation as well. So Chimigwich. I also would like to start off, I guess, officially this festival today to thank our partners. It's always putting on an event like this is never a lone event. There's always people that are helping us along the way. I would very much this year, more than other years, thank the Toronto Region Conservation Authority for all of your help. And TRCA has always been a great partner in a number of the different festivals that I've had over the years. And you're always one of the organizations that people think of when they think of water and when they think of conservation in the Toronto area. So thank you to all of the staff in advance. I'd also like to thank the Richmond Hill Historical Society for their partnership, and they've been with us right from the very beginning as well. And thank you. I know there's a number of members tuning in today, and I thank you for your help and partnership. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, JKO Planning Services, JG Cordoni Investments Limited, and Garden Homes. And I also would like to, at this moment, acknowledge, it's hard to see an event like this, but usually at a council event, we would always acknowledge our colleagues who are here. I believe today we have Councillor Karen Silovitz tuning in. So thank you, Councillor Silovitz, for your participation today. So as we move through the morning, we'll be launching a series of polls to see how well you know your maple syrup facts, Richmond Hill. To give you a hint, some of these questions are taken from the scavenger hunt that's on the website. And so with that in mind, if you pay attention and submit a completed scavenger hunt, you will be entered for a prize draw. So if I can ask Andrew at this point to launch the first poll. So what are other names for maple syrup? Liquid amber, liquid gold, liquid sugar, or golden delicious? So we'll give you a few more seconds to answer that. Okay, almost done. We're getting quite a few responses here. They're all good. Okay, I think we're pretty close to closing the poll. Andrew, if we could get the results, please. Okay, so 79% liquid gold, 15% liquid amber, 3% liquid sugar, and 3% golden delicious. I will tell you that we started off on an easy one here, and all of those are right. So whatever you answered, you are correct. It's all good, and it's all very indicative of what maple syrup means to people. So at this point in time, I would like to now introduce Wendy Gale, who is a staff person at the TRCA, and she will be here today to teach us more about maple syrup. And I'd like to welcome her. So thank you, Wendy, for joining us. The subject of her presentation today is Mystery Objects, the Maple Edition. So a little bit about Wendy. Wendy is an educator at the Black Creek Pioneer Village, which I'm sure lots of us have been to at some point in our life. I know I certainly have, and if you haven't, I certainly would, when things open up, would recommend that you do go visit Black Creek Pioneer Village. It's very interesting. But Wendy will be helping us guess the use of maple sugaring objects and artifacts found at Black Creek Pioneer Village in their collection. Together, we will discover fascinating facts about maple syrup production and usage. So without any further ado, over to you, Wendy.
Thank you very much. Miigwech, it's a real honor to be included here. We're in Sam's house, and I'd like to thank both Elder Wabagoo and Councillor West for inviting us. We're thrilled to be here. Now, one of the first artifacts or pieces of technology that we have here was actually shared to us by the First Nations people. So what do you think this is? Maybe some of you have actually tried using these. If you guess snowshoes, you were right. Snowshoes help us to stay on top of the snow. So if the snow is first flying, of course, one of the things we need to do is get out to the maple trees and use this tool here. Can you see this tool? Or bring it a bit closer.
Yep, thumbs up.
Okay, and what do you think this tool is used for? If you guess drilling into the tree, it's an auger. That's what you're going to actually drill into the tree so that you can get at the sap. And for the First Nations, when they were teaching the early settlers on in through to even present day today, even though some of the tools have changed, the basic production of getting sap from the tree and making that into syrup has not changed through time at all. So we do that, and then we need to put something into the tree. So at first, can everybody see what this is? It's made of wood. For the First Nations, they would have used something similar. You know what it's for? But theirs might have been made out of maybe a cedar shingle. If you guessed a spile, this is what would be tacked into the tree so that you could actually, once the sap starts to run, that it would come out and drip. And you've got to have 3 days of freezing cold temperature and 3 days of warming up. A lovely day like today, it's so beautiful. And then they switch to this, which is essentially the same thing. Have you guessed what it is, or do I need to bring it closer?
Why don't you bring it closer?
Okay. Oh, here. Wrong one. Sorry, guys. Can you see? Whoops. There we go. Oh, my fingers are all in the way, aren't they? There we go. If you've guessed a spile again, you guessed completely right. And what's going to go on? You can see there's a little hook here. And I don't think I need to explain what this is. Sorry. This, of course, is your sap bucket, and this is what the sap is going to flow into. So that made it so that the sap could drip into there. And we know if you've gone to the sugar bush, or if you haven't, the sap itself looks very much like water because, of course, it's mostly water and just a very, very little bit of sugar. Now, when you're pouring it from the sap bucket, and what the early settlers would have done, just a little bit different from what the First Nations people would have done, which was they would have either hollowed out a log and then could have used deer antlers to take hot stones from the fire and put them into the log, or they could have used crockery to do the same thing. And what they were doing was boiling away the water to get to the sugar. And that's exactly what the early settlers would have done. The only slight change that they made to the process was that they would have had huge pots, cauldrons, and they would have got together and shared, and you needed 3. You wanted to have one fire that was a good roaring fire that's going to boil away that water very vigorously. That's where the fresh sap gets put. Next fire is a medium one. So if you think of your stove at home, you've got that high temperature, the medium temperature. You're going to take and switch it because now that sap has started to caramelize and you're getting closer to syrup. And you're going to put that in there, put fresh sap in the first one, boil away some more. Then you're going to take it and put it into the final pot. And the reason you do that is if you added fresh sap to the sap you've already boiled away the water, you're going to burn it at the bottom. It's going to scald. You've got a small fire in the last one is what you're going to do. But even before we can quite do that, anybody guess what this is? Not a hat. It's made out of felt. It's got a wooden frame to it. And this is actually so that when you pour that sap in here, because it might have bugs. Yesterday I saw wasps out, so all the flying insects are starting to wake up too. So that gets any bugs or leaves or anything that might have fallen into the sap out of it. So it's just a strainer made out of felt. And so what we're going to do, what they would have done and what the First Nations people would have taught the early settlers, what the Victorians would have done was you're not going to leave it as much as we would like to. Some of it we could enjoy as syrup, but we're not going to leave it at syrup because without a refrigerator in your house yet, if you left it at this, that's going to rot. So we don't want that. It's too precious. So what we're going to do is boil it even further. So if you think of 40 liters of sap is going to give you 1 liter of syrup, and we have to boil it further than that just so we can get maple sugar, which is absolute magic. What we would have done was pack that into molds so that we could keep that because it kept so much longer. And the advantage of this, of course, is that this would have been at home. You didn't have to have this shipped in like you would have had to have cane sugar shipped in at the time. So because it's at home, it's a product that is frugal, but it does take time. So can you tell me, why do you have a March break? So think back to what people are doing. Think back to all this sweetness, and it's going to take you roughly the entire month of March so that you can produce all this maple sugar. If you guessed March break was because you were pulled out of school to help produce with your family, or maybe a neighboring family that might have a sugar bush, then you guessed right. It's because you were pulled from school, and that's how that worked. We also have another, oh, maybe I'll bring both of these a little bit closer, and there we go. Now I've got it. So we've got one sugaring mold here. You can see there's some designs in it. Get my fingers out of the way. It's made out of wood. And then we've got a candy mold here. This one's actually made out of metal. You could have used these. I've also seen pictures for the First Nations where they were also making sugar loaves as well. And they would have used birch bark containers, baskets that they would have lined, and then they could have used those. And so it can get quite heavy. So yeah, so these are some of our tools that we have here that you would use every day. You would have spent the entire month of March at the sugar hut. You would not have gone home. So yeah, so they would have brought that. And I guess I'm going to wrap that up right now. And there is going to be a poll coming up. So we challenge you to have lots of fun answering the questions to the poll. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So Andrew, I think we had referenced a poll. If there's a poll ready to go up, we'll do our second poll right now. So what do you think was more popular in the 18th century? Maple syrup or maple sugar? So we'll give people a few more seconds to answer that, and we'll have some questions and answers that we've got for Wendy as well after we're done. So a couple more seconds on the poll. Okay, so Andrew, what's the result of our poll? So we've got 79% saying maple sugar and 21% saying maple syrup. So Wendy, I'd be interested to know the answer to this. What is the answer?
So maple sugar was more popular because, of course, the syrup would have rotted on your shelves without a fridge to keep it in. So way to go. That's excellent.
That's good. I have to tell you, I did try to make maple sugar this year on my own. And I can attest to what a disaster that was. And I had the modern technology and a stove and everything. So if the First Nations folks and the settlers were making maple sugar back in the time without thermometers and stoves, I salute them. That's not an easy task. So there's a couple of questions, Wendy, if we could. And I should also say I can attest to some of the tools that you were showing here. There are photos of my great grandfather and grandfather with exactly the same, some of the same things that you've showed us today. I will say it's interesting with the snowshoes, because when maple syrup season starts, oftentimes the snow is still up to your waist, and collecting heavy laden of sap and taking it to the evaporator without snowshoes would be a workout beyond what you'd get at Good Life Fitness, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So can you just comment on, so some of the more the implements that you talked about today, are there modifications and similar implements being used today in maple syrup production?
You know what, really, truly, it hasn't changed with time. Yes, the tools look slightly different, but evaporators, when you go to a sugar bush today and you see an evaporator, those came out in the 1850s. They are not new technology. Whether you fire it with wood inside of it, or maybe today they might use, say, propane or something like that, it is still the same function. From when the First Nations people would have done it to today, us trying it at home, you really haven't changed anything your tools are slightly different, but it's the same process. You're just boiling away the water. It's how do you boil away the water? That's all. And even the snowshoes might have changed slightly in the way that they look. But the reality is that snowshoes, the technology, the design of them was so perfect from the beginning that it's still the same, like I say, maybe it's aluminum or something like now that's being used for it, for the brace, like the frame, but it's still doing the same job. So it's amazing. Sometimes when it's made right the first time, you just can't improve on it.
It's interesting how the principles behind maple syrup making have not changed. I mean, ever, like right from the very beginning, before settlers arrived in Canada. I mean, the principles that the First Nations community was using in just boiling off that excess water to make it a more concentrated sugar is certainly something that's common. It's interesting, actually, you mentioned about the wood too, because I think some of the larger maple syrup producers that I know of today are still using wood to fire their evaporators. And in fact, they get the wood from their sugar bushes. And if you don't take more wood than grows back in a given year, then it is actually a sustainable form of fuel too, which is also interesting. So what do you think is the most unusual tool used in the process that you have at Black Creek Pioneer Village?
I think, you know what? I think some of the ones that I like the best would be things like the molds, that they were so creative with the beautiful carvings that could go in the molds to decorate them, or the candy molds and things like that. So I think people are so inventive with what they do and how they decorate and how they try to bring that joy into their lives.
What do you, in all of those tools that you have behind you there, what is the most hard to guess when you have guests coming to Black Creek Pioneer Village?
Probably, I guess, yeah, the auger is a tricky one. We've got two, this one here. So, whoops. There we go. So this is actually a sugar auger, and sugar was something that was around at that period, but it was so much more expensive. With the maple, I think it would be perhaps the filter, just to make it so that you could filter out what might have got into it, because it does kind of look like a hat.
Was that filter used both for filtering the sap and also for filtering the syrup when it was ready as well? I would think you probably would have had two different filters for that, just in case as you're doing it, because you do skim off the top of the, you are skimming off as you're going along when you're actually boiling off the water. So I would imagine you probably had a couple. That sounds great. We have a couple more polls, but before we do launch that, I just have one more question, Wendy. It measured in centimeters, how big are the smiles of the kids that you give maple syrup samples to at Courtright and Bruce's Mill?
You know what? I think it's ear to ear. It's so good. It's such a magical, it's such a magical treat. So yeah. Yeah, I don't think you could measure that kind of smile.
No, it's unmeasurable. I agree with you 100%. So we have, I think we have a couple more polls before we move on to our next presentation. So Andrew, if you could launch the next poll from Wendy's presentation.
Actually, Councillor, if I could jump in, we do actually have a couple more questions from the attendees.
Oh, I'm sorry, you know what? I didn't see that there. Thank you. Oh, good question, actually. How long does it take from start to finish, from sap to syrup, and then also to maple sugar?
Oh my gosh. For the sap, when I was at the sugar bush at Bruce's Mill, you're there 24 hours. Well, we weren't, but they would have been there 24 hours a day, nonstop. So if I remember right, you're probably boiling, I think it's about, I want to say around 6 hours to go from one end to the other. But then if you're doing sugar, it's even longer than that. So I might be off Sorry? I think it might be a full day. A full day to do it, because then you're going to bring more sap, but it went round the clock. You never stopped. You had to keep going. So when you started in late February to actually put the taps in the tree, you went round the clock starting, I guess, March, until the end of March, about the first 2 weeks of April, depending on the weather, round the clock. So about a day.
Right. And I guess the maple syrup season ends as soon as the buds start to come out, because then the sap starts tasting kind of funny. So it depends, I guess, on how long the season is, and that would vary from year to year.
Yes. And
Right.
if you happen to see those white moths coming around, that's what we noticed at Bruce's Mill. And if you need to use your sap right away, do it right away. Don't leave it hanging around. If it goes milky color,
Right.
you were too late.
Right. And one final question then, how would the sugar, maple sugar, be stored? Would that be able to be stored without refrigeration?
Yes. Yep. You could start without I can't even speak. You can start without the refrigeration. That's why you kept it there. Probably here it would have been in a root cellar to keep it down there. It would just need to be somewhere dry and cool.
Right.
You could always rehydrate it by adding a little bit of water to it so that you can get back to a syrup state. So
Right.
that's what you can do in your cooking, and you would just chip that off and add it to your cooking.
Okay. And I guess actually we just had one more question come in.
Sure.
What is the difference between maple syrup and birch syrup?
Well, one of the biggest differences would be that maple syrup, the maple tree has the highest concentration of sugar in the sap. And so it's the actual, I guess, sweetness of it would be the biggest difference of it. To be honest, I haven't tried birch syrup, but that's my understanding, is that the highest content of sugar is in the maple tree, and that's why it's so sweet and so wonderful to have.
Right. I actually have had birch syrup. It tastes nothing like maple syrup, and
Oh,
yeah, I have to say maple syrup is still my favorite. But actually, sorry, one more question just came in. How long does it take for a piece of maple candy? Maple candy is somewhere in between maple syrup and maple sugar, right?
yeah, to make it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Probably just from start to finish, maybe half an hour, 45 minutes
Right.
to get the heat up. Depending on if you're doing it over a fire. Fire would depend on what kind of wood you're using. And like here, you'll see when I go over the other spot, I think the wood stove, it would depend on that. But I would say about half an hour, 45 minutes tops.
Right. Right. Well, thank you. Those are all the questions that we have at the moment. So Andrew, do we have another poll question, I think, related to Wendy's presentation? Is that right?
We do. I'm going to launch it right now.
Okay. All right. So what do you tap into the tree to make sap come out? A spile, a straw, or a spike? Okay. I'm watching the results come in. It looks like we've got some pretty good answers here. A few more seconds for this and we'll close the poll and share the results. All right, so we'll close the poll. And so 65% said a spile, 1% said a straw, and 13% said a spike. And I believe, Wendy, if I'm not mistaken, the answer is a spile.
That's exactly right.
All right.
Yeah. So I think what you need to do is take all those people when it's safe again out so they can all try the spile.
Right, right, exactly. All right. So thank you. I think what we'll do now is we're going to, Wendy, you're going to be back in a few minutes teaching us how to make maple harvest switchel drink, which I'm looking forward to. And at this time, what I'd like to do is introduce a little musical interlude that we're going to have with Jay Edmonds and Michael Kettmer. So we have a special treat for you now. For those of you that have attended the festival in person in the past, this music might sound familiar. Please join me in welcoming Jay Edmonds and Michael Kettmer, a traditional folk duo from Peterborough. With Jay on the fiddle and mandolin and Michael on guitar and hammered dulcimer, they have been making toe-tapping music for dances, fairs, and historic sites across Central Ontario for over 2 decades. Jay and Michael have been the soundtrack of our Maple Syrup Festival since our first festival, and many have tapped our toes to the music while enjoying our pancakes and maple syrup throughout the years at the Maple Syrup Festival. So we can't celebrate in person this year, but they have been gracious enough to provide us with some music for today's festivities. So while we enjoy Jay and Michael's entertainment, I would invite you to jump up and move around. And now that, and also if you have time, go get the ingredients for the Maple Harvest Switchel drink. The recipe will be on the screen in a minute. And after you move to the music, we'll be ready for your favorite refreshing beverage. So over to you, Andrew, and also to Jay and Michael.
Thank you, everybody. Now we're going to stop sharing my screen, and Councillor West, I'll turn over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you to Jay and Michael, and we'll be hearing more of Jay and Michael at the end of today's presentation as well. So thank you to them. That's definitely a unique type of music, and it's certainly, they have been the soundtrack for the live Maple Syrup Festival in the past, and we're glad that they can be with us again today. So I think for those of you that were getting up and dancing, you're certainly going to be ready for a nice cool drink, and Wendy is here to help us with that. So before we do that though, I'd like to launch one more poll. So Andrew, if you could launch that, we have that ready to go.
Yes, here we go.
All right, which of these words is used to talk about the process of maple syrup making? Choose all that apply. So maple, tap, sugaring, sap run, evaporator, spile, and shack. All right, looks like our numbers are coming in. Well, I think people are really acing this one. Okay, a couple more seconds. I think we can end the poll, Andrew.
Yep.
And share the results. All right, so it was pretty much equal across the board. Almost everybody chose all of them, and that actually is the correct answer. All of these words describe the process of turning sap into syrup. And like many crops, the sugaring season has its own tools and special terminology, and these are many of them. So thank you very much for that. So at this time, I would like to reintroduce Wendy from the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. And I hope everybody has their ingredients ready. I know I do, and I'm ready for that thirst quenching drink. So let's go virtually to the Halfway House Kitchen at Black Creek Pioneer Village and mix up some Maple Harvest Switchel. Take it away, Wendy.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to make this drink. It was very popular in that time period. It's a great one when you've been out in the sugar bush to actually get some of those, the energy you need back. So it's kind of like the Gatorade of its time period. And this recipe comes to us from the 1850s from a cookbook, the American Cookery, oh, I forget which one it was, sorry. Practical American Cookery and Economy. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your cider vinegar, so apple cider vinegar, and you're going to do 1 tablespoon of it. There we go. And then in some of the recipes, if it was summertime, what you might use instead of maple syrup would have been maybe molasses, because that would have been available to you. But this is sugaring off time, and so because of that, we're going to use maple syrup, which is another really popular substitute for this drink. You're going to use 4 teaspoons of it. You're just going to pour that in. There we go. And then, you're going to use a 1/4 teaspoon of ginger, and ginger was very popular. It was one of the first spices that was actually produced and sold internationally. It came from Southeast Asia, and by the time period that the village is showing you, you're actually getting it either from India or highly prized from Jamaica in that time period as well. So just mix that in a little bit. You're going to take some fresh cold water, and you're going to just mix that in. And now you have Switchel. So it was incredibly popular. Also, if you had been attending a sugar bush and helping out for all that time, because families did that together, what you might have found was that they might have imbibed a little bit. And if they were a little worse for the wear, this was a good morning after drink. So it's a great drink. Try your Switchel. What do you think of it?
All right, thank you, Wendy. I do have mine here. I'm going to give it a taste right now. That is delicious. And I have to be honest with you, I'd never heard of the term Switchel, but you had said in your presentation that it was the Gatorade of the time. And I have to think that maybe there's an economic opportunity for somebody to be making a new kind of Gatorade with a lot less processed sugar in it. So thank you very much for that. So we have a couple of questions. So I found it interesting you were saying about sugaring off time in the past was something that a lot of families did together, and it was a big job. And you had referenced earlier, sometimes people would be up all night long firing the evaporator and keeping the sap flowing. I often hear stories about, it was not all work, there was some play. And so how common would it be for, at that time of year, for families to be using some of the maple syrup fresh that they were making, to celebrate?
Oh, when they were out in the bush, it would have been very common. If you look at the pictures that have come from the period, you'll notice that, they're cooking with it. And it's not just, you can pour some of the syrup into the snow and then you've got a candy, which is a lot of fun to do. You can also use sap in your stew. If you want a really good stew, it tastes so good. Or you can even use sap in your drinks like we did with the switchel, but you can also use sap to make your coffee, and I would imagine maybe your tea too, which is, it just makes it a little bit sweeter and really yummy. Oh yeah, and the parties. They would have lots of parties, sugaring off parties, where families got together and you celebrated because it was a work bee together. And so to cap off all of that hard work, that was sort of the prize at the end of it, because you were out there for so long nonstop.
Right, it was a lot of work. I'm sure that it would be having some of that maple sugar would help to restore your energy levels. I know that there's been a lot of talk lately about people who are far more food aware than I am, and good chefs and so on. I think there's been a lot more people using maple syrup in their cooking. Do you know if there's a kind of a general rule about substituting maple syrup for sugar, where the recipe calls for sugar, but it's people would substitute maple syrup instead?
I believe it's usually equal amounts. Double check though, but I believe it's equal amounts. If it was a cup of sugar, then you probably want about roughly a cup of the maple syrup. The advantage is that the maple syrup is even healthier for you. It's got all sorts of minerals in it that are really good for you. It's like that perfect food. So of course you always need to follow your own diet guidelines for yourself, but maple is a very healthy choice.
Right. And I'm assuming that you could make a batch of switchel, say on a warm summer day as well, but and I guess it would keep for some time if you left it in the fridge.
Yes, it was one of those drinks that people pretty much made and drank right on the spot because it's trying to quench your thirst. So if you think of, you've been out either in a sugar bush, and although it might seem like, oh my goodness, it's so cold out there, you were bringing in saps a bucket, and as you're going along, you'll have the team of horses drawing this huge barrel, and the horses could go themselves without having to have you guide them, and you would just be running as fast as you could to put those in. So by the time you're getting a drink of this, you're pretty hot. And if you're by the fire, adding the wood and stirring and constantly moving, you're hot. So because of that, this was something you drink right away. And because the ingredients are so portable, this is going to be used just at this time though. Later on, if you wanted to have that maple, it would have been a chip of sugar that you're going to put in and stir. So just a little.
Sure. So I have a couple of questions that have come in here as well since we started. There's a question here, is it okay to use fresh ginger?
I don't see why not. All you need to do is crush it.
Okay.
Because it's powdered.
Right. Okay.
You might need a mortar and pestle.
Right. just to release the flavor, I guess, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I should mention to you that the person that asked that also did a follow-up comment that, wow, is it ever delicious? So
Oh, good.
clearly people are enjoying it. Maybe a final question here that we have in the queue. What is the most unique foods that you like to eat with maple syrup? And I guess the obvious one that comes to mind is pancakes, but there's a whole lot more to maple syrup than just pancakes, right?
Yeah, well, there's, you can add it to, like I was saying, you can add it to your stews, which we might not normally think about, or even the sap itself, so that it just caramelizes a little bit and gives a bit of a sweetness to your stew. Or you can add it, use the sap itself to make your coffee as the coffee, like the liquid for it. Trying to think what else. You can add it into muffins and puddings and things like that. Remember, puddings back in the 19th century aren't quite what we think of puddings today, though. They're not those creamy, milky ones. They're very often more of a bread type pudding.
Right.
Those are good. Or maybe
Actually-
even if you made a baked apple, you could use maple syrup for it instead of sugar, which would
Right,
be
right.
incredible.
Interesting. Actually, a couple more questions. This is actually very interesting. I'd never thought about this. Can we freeze it into ice cubes and use it for later? Now, I'm assuming that means syrup, but I suppose the same thing could also be with sap too, right?
Well, I would question whether you could, and the only reason I say that is because when the First Nations, when I was reading about it, when they would be preparing to get the sap the same way as the early settlers would have learned from them, what they would have done that was really clever was they would have skimmed the ice off the top of the sap as they put it in to boil it. So I don't know that the sugar
To
would,
extract the water.
yeah, I don't know if it would freeze quite as well. That's a
Right.
good question. I have to try that out because I know that they're skimming off the actual frozen water on the sap.
Very interesting. Well, thank you, Wendy. We really appreciate you coming out there and particularly doing this in such an authentic way at the kitchen in the Black Creek Pioneer Village. So thank you very much for.
Councillor, sorry, if I can jump in, we do have a couple more questions as well that have just come in.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we do. We've got a comment here that this one of our viewers uses it in maple syrup and baking muffins, which, you know, she says is delicious and healthier than the sugar we use today. And also in oatmeal. I can actually attest to both of those things.
Those are great.
Yeah. Do you know if do you know anything about the differences between maple sugar and processed sugar in terms of the health benefits? You had kind of referenced that earlier.
Maple sugar all the way.
Right.
Because of sugar is refined. Basically what happens with sugar cane, and this is just a rough description of it. When it's processed, it's spun, and they're spinning the molasses out of the sugar, so that's how you end up with white sugar. And it's a very rough. If you ever get a chance, there's a sugar refinery museum down in downtown Toronto that's fun to go to. But health-wise, maple syrup, and not to this sugar, but maple syrup or maple sugar is much, much more beneficial. It has way more minerals in it. It has, it's just the health benefits are much, much better for you. So it's a good one to choose if you can have sugar in your diet. So I would recommend that all the way.
Right. I guess the difference is that the sap that you know we ultimately make into maple syrup is really the nutrients that the tree uses to put on leaves and stay healthy. And so I've heard that too, that there's a lot of dissolved minerals and you know, and various, you know, goodness in that in maple sap that the trees are actually using, that we're, you know, we are borrowing some of them from the trees. And I think, so what you're saying, I think is very consistent with the science of that.
Everything from calcium to magnesium are in it, and it's not like it's huge amounts, but it's something, so it's good for you.
Right. Okay, one more question here before we move on. When will you produce a maple syrup recipe book as an educational tool and fundraiser? Does the TRCA do that?
I don't know, maybe they will.
Well, there you go.
It'll be like.
Join our education programs.
Yeah.
No, that's great. Well, thanks everybody for the questions. And again, thank you very much for your presentation, Wendy.
So we're gonna, sorry to cut you off, Wendy, we have, there's a few poll questions.
Right.
That Wendy and the TRCA folks would just like to ask the audience for some feedback on the maple switcher. So if I'm gonna launch a couple poll questions, Councillor, for you.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, first question. Have you heard of Switchel before? Few more seconds to answer that. I had already mentioned I certainly had not heard that, so we'll close the poll and share the results. So no, 92% of us, including myself, have never heard of Switchel. So thank you, Wendy, for that.
It's a funny drink, isn't it?
It is.
Though.
It's very unique tasting, I think, because of the vinegar in it as well. It's got a very unusual taste.
Okay.
Yeah, delicious though.
So I have two more questions, Councillor, that I'll pull up here
Okay.
now to launch.
Do you like the taste of Switchel? Yes, I drink it again. Once is enough, and maybe not so much. Okay, we've got lots of people that obviously have made it at home, getting some good results here. All right, so we'll end that poll. So yes, I'd like to drink it again seems to win at 70%. Once was enough. I appreciate the enthusiasm of those people for being adventurous and trying it. And no, that was disgusting. You know what? That's totally okay. Thank you.
And the last poll question.
Okay, which of the following drinks from the 1860s would you rather try? Raspberry vinegar, spruce beer, or apple water? Okay, we've got a few coming in here. A few more seconds here. This is a three-parter, so it requires some people to think a little bit more than a yes and no question. All right. So the winner is apple water. I'm surprised that I would assume that's very similar to apple juice. Is that right, Wendy?
Yes, it's somewhat similar to that. It's just, you know, if you've made applesauce or something and you're boiling down the apples, it's the juice from that. So it was a very soothing drink.
Okay. And actually, can you tell us about spruce beer or raspberry vinegar? I've never heard of either of those either.
So the raspberry vinegar is, it's a drink that has a little bit of a kick to it because it's fermented a little bit, but it's got that raspberry flavor to it. So that's a yummy one. And the spruce beer is kind of like ginger ale. So although it's called a beer, it's like ginger ale. It's not ale. It's a drink. And ginger ale started out as a soothing drink as well. So yeah, so all three of those would be yummy drinks to drink.
Would spruce beer taste a little bit like spruce trees smell? I suppose so, right?
Yeah, it
That'd
might be an acquired taste. Like
yeah, I would think so too. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much again, Wendy. We appreciate your giving us all this information and a beautiful, delicious drink to boot. So at this time, I'd like to move on to our final presentation. And this is one with Leanna D'Andrea from the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. And I have to say that this topic is near and dear to my heart. Her presentation is called Spring in the Sugar Bush. And Leanna is a community coordinator of learning with the TRCA. And Leanna will help us to discover the sweetness of early spring and show us how to identify maple trees and how sap is produced within the trees and tapped to make maple syrup. So I think if we were able to do this live and in person, maybe we could have some real maple trees, but next year we'll do that. So over to you, Leanna. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Councillor West, for the introduction and invitation to present today. Yeah, today will have to be the next best thing with our virtual presentation. And so, as mentioned, I'm with TRCA, and this organization plays a lot of different functions really to take care of the 9 watersheds in the Lake Ontario shoreline with many partners in the communities we serve. So we work to preserve and protect the land, improving wildlife and plant habitats through a variety of different work, from restoration and monitoring. And we also encourage people of all ages to get out and enjoy nature, or join us virtually to learn about it and then get out on your own time. And so, as Councillor West mentioned, I'm with the community learning team at TRCA. So maybe you've joined us for a nature walk or a community tree planting event, or maybe even recently at one of our virtual events. Or maybe you even have visited one of our conservation areas and been to the Maple Syrup Festival at the Courtright Centre or Bruce's Mill. But nevertheless, I'm excited to present some information on maple forest and springtime this time of year. And so I'll be talking a little bit about spring in the sugar bush, discovering the sweetness of early spring. And so we'll be looking at how sap is produced and flows within a tree, how you can identify maple trees this time of year, and how they're tapped for sap to make maple syrup. And as I'd begin, I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm on traditional Indigenous territory, and at TRCA, we respectfully recognize that these lands are traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular, those of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe of the Williams First Treaty Nations, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And so I really appreciate and respect the history and diversity of the land, and am grateful to have the opportunity to work and meet in this territory, even virtually today. All right, so yesterday was the first day of spring, and as we enter the spring season, the days are getting longer and warmer, and the snow is melting away in the forest. Maybe you've seen some flowers starting to peek through the leaf litter on the forest floor, or maybe you've heard new birds calling in your neighborhood, or even visiting your feeders. The signs of spring are certainly all around us. And in early spring, deciduous trees, or the ones that shed their leaves in the fall, are preparing for another growing season. These trees have been dormant during the winter months, storing their sugars in their roots, branches, and in the trunk, waiting for spring. And the sugars are the tree's energy, just like how we eat food, and move through the tree as sap. But sap is mostly water, as we've heard already, with only small amounts of sugars and minerals. For example, the sugar maple tree, the sugar content in the sap is about 2 to 2.5%. And this is even lower in other tree species. And these sugars that are present in the sap were actually produced last summer during the growing season in the tree's sugar production centers, also known as leaves. And so I'd like to launch a quick poll here and ask you if you know how the sugar was formed. What process do maple trees use to make sugar? And so we'll just pull up the poll. Do you think it is called sugaring? Is it sugar synthesis? Is it photosynthesis? Or is it maple magic? All right, so we're getting some answers for most of them. I guess Maple Magic was a giveaway that it wasn't that one. But so many of you guessed photosynthesis, and you are correct. Photo meaning light. The leaves in last summer captured sunlight and used the energy to convert water and minerals from the soil and carbon dioxide from the air into oxygen and sugars. And so now in the spring, when the days are warm, the sap actually rises to the buds from the roots and the branches. And this sap will provide energy for the tree to put out new leaves and start producing sugars all over again. So it's a really special time of year for the trees. And of course, this makes for a sweet time of year. The greatest sap flow in the trees really happen when there are several warm days, so between 3 to 5 degrees, and cold nights between -3 to -5 degrees. And the warm days are what cause the tree's internal pressure to really build up and allow that sap to start flowing. But the nights that are cold are really key because during the night, the tree can cool down and absorb moisture from the ground via the roots and keep the process going. And so this is, of course, is when maple trees are tapped because we have the most sap flow and we're collecting that sap to make maple syrup. And maple trees grow all around the world, but our climate makes it ideal for collecting this maple sap because of the temperatures that we have. And maple trees have been growing in this area for thousands of years, moving their sap each spring. And so as we heard a bit about already, Indigenous peoples that lived in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River area were the first to really discover Sweetwater and make maple syrup. And one way was to collect sap in birch bark baskets called muckucks. And then they would pour that sap into the hollowed out logs that we heard a bit about from Black Creek. And in those logs, the sugars would concentrate into maple syrup or even to maple sugar. During those cold nights, the water would float to the top and freeze, making it really easy just to scoop off some ice and start that concentration and really reduce the boiling time. But also rocks would be heated on the fire and added to the sap to bring it to a boil to really get rid of that water. And today, many Indigenous peoples have traditions and teachings around this season, some referring to it as the Sugar Month or Maple Moon. And so there are many stories and theories about the discovery of Sweetwater, including taking cues from wildlife. Of course, it is a sweet time of year for all of us. White-tailed deer, red and gray squirrels can all be seen licking sap from maple trees. Red squirrels are particularly clever. They'll actually make cuts in the trunk or in branches with their large front teeth. And then they'll leave the sap to ooze from the cuts. And over time, the water starts to evaporate away, and the red squirrels will actually wait and then come back a bit later to find a somewhat form of maple syrup that they can lick away and get more sugar content. So some really interesting things happening in the sugar bush this time of year. And so I'd like to launch another poll right now. So if we're looking at this photo, what do you think made these holes? What else do you think is happening in the forest this time of year? Do you think these were made by carpenter ants, yellow-bellied sapsuckers, or maybe maple syrup tappers? So we'll give you a few seconds there to choose what you think made these holes. All right, I'm seeing votes for all of the answers, but overwhelming votes for the yellow-bellied sapsucker, and you got it. Incredibly, these holes were made by a bird called the yellow-bellied sapsucker, which is part of the woodpecker family. And incredibly, sapsuckers rely on sap as a main food source, just like their name tells us. So just like we tap trees to make maple syrup, these birds drill sap wells in the spring. And sapsucker wells are neatly organized with several holes drilled in horizontal rows, as you can see on in the pictures there. And sapsuckers are so smart, they'll choose a tree species with the highest sugar concentrations in their sap. So as we know already, that's the sugar maples, but also red maple, paper birch, yellow birch, and hickory. And when they're drilling their sap wells, the holes really only need to go far enough into the tree to encourage the sap to flow. And so healthy trees can easily grow over and seal those holes. And so this activity really does not pose too much of a threat to these trees. So an amazing process that's happening in our forests. All right, so let's take a look at some of our local maple species and how we can identify them in the spring. There are over 150 different species of maple trees in the world, and 10 are native to Canada, and even fewer are native to this area, meaning they've been here for thousands of years. But not every variety is used to make maple syrup. Primarily sugar maple, black maple, and red maple are tapped for sap in Canada. And the main maple producing tree is the sugar maple because it has the highest percentage of sugars in the sap. Also, another great thing about sugar maples is that they're some of the last buds to open. So we've talked a bit about this already today. So, as soon as those buds open, the sap is starting to run to the buds to fuel the production of new leaves, making the sap not ideal for maple syrup production. It starts to turn cloudy and has a foul taste. So by the sugar maples being the last to open their buds, it means we have more time to collect that maple sap. So it's really good for the production. And so how can we identify sugar maple trees in the forest this time of year? Usually it's helpful to look at the leaves of the trees or even the distinct fruit, those maple keys, which we see later in the year into the fall. But this time of year, there's no leaves on deciduous trees. And so early maple syrup producers may have marked maple trees in the summer while the leaves were out, maybe tying a ribbon around them so that they knew come the spring which trees were sugar maples and which ones they wanted to tap. But there's certainly lots of clues that you can use this time of year to identify maple trees. Firstly, you can look at the bark, especially this mature tree that we can see here. It's got gray-brown bark with long vertical ridges that are open on one end, so they can be distinct. Of course, tree bark does change as the tree ages, and the ridges get deeper, kind of like wrinkles that we have. Another way to really look and identify whether it's a maple tree is to look at the branching. The arrangement of the branches are going to be opposite, which is not that common in nature. So that will help narrow down the type of tree. And lastly, you can look at the buds, which are really distinct even across maple species. And so the sugar maple buds are pointed and covered in these reddish brown scales. But here in the Greater Toronto Area, there are also 2 maple species that are considered invasive. This may be a new term for you. These are introduced species that have adapted really well to the area and are now a threat for displacing native species like the sugar maples. And so these include the Manitoba maple, which are really easy to identify because this is the only maple species that has compound leaves. So when we look at a leaf, like the sugar maple, it's a simple leaf, whereas the Manitoba maple has compound leaves, which means one leaf is made up of many leaflets. So what we see pictured here is actually just one leaf. And the second invasive maple is the Norway maple. And the leaves look really similar to sugar maple trees. And so it can make it challenging to tell them apart. But a couple ways to really tell them apart is in the fall. The Norway maples commonly get something called the black spot fungus. And so it makes it really easy to distinguish. And also another trick is to look at the sap of the Norway maple. It's actually white and milky, as opposed to our sugar maple sap that is going to be clear. And Norway maples also come in many varieties. So like pictured here, the King Crimson maple. So they come in many different shapes and colors because they're so easy to manipulate genetically. And these were planted really widely across the GTA because they tolerate those harsh urban conditions so well. But the problem is when they make their way into our natural environment, Norway maples grow really quickly, creating a really thick, dense canopy that has a lot of shade that stops other plants from growing and even other sugar maples and other plants from actually establishing. So they can definitely be a problem in our natural areas. But the good news is that we can all play a role in helping to stop the spread of invasive species. And the first way is just to learn more about them. You can check out some of these guidebooks that we have listed here to really learn how to identify them and manage them on our properties. And so when you're choosing plants for your garden, make sure they're not invasive, and even better, try to choose native plants that will have a host of benefits for native wildlife. We can also help stop the spread. So making sure we're disposing of yard waste properly and not into natural areas that could spread seeds, staying on trails when we're walking through the forest so that we don't spread plants or seeds, and also just talking to our friends and neighbors about it and spreading the word about invasive plants. You can also get really involved and actually report invasive species. There's databases like EDD Maps, the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System, so scientists can actually track the spread of these species. So lots of ways to help play a part in invasive species. All right, so Now that we've talked a bit about spring and the forest, let's look at actually the maple syrup production. And so this area has a long history of maple syrup making, like we've heard a bit from already from El Dorado and from Black Creek Pioneer Village. So I'm just going to briefly touch on the process of making maple syrup today. So let's look at collecting sap. Maple syrup is a wonderful renewable resource when it's harvested correctly. And producers know only to take about 10% of each tree's sap each year so that the tree remains healthy and continues to produce sap year after year. And so a maple tree that's about as big around the diameter of a dinner plate is about 40 years old and is ready to have one tap. And the size of the tree is usually measured at chest level or about 1.4 meters above the ground. So that's how we check and measure whether the trees are ready to be tapped. And so to access the sap, you need to drill in only about 3 inches. And this is to reach the sapwood of the tree, that outer layer, that living portion, and it's often lighter in color, so we can see there in the picture. You do not need to drill into the heartwood of the tree. This is what supports the tree and does not have any sap. And so the larger the circumference of the tree, the more taps you can put in it, remembering that we only want to harvest about 10% of the sap. When you're putting in a hole, the tree is really only draining sap from that area, and sap is running all around the rest of the tree. And so a tree that's about this size that we have pictured can have about 2 taps, producing over 80 liters of sap in a year. So I'd like to run a poll. If we're taking a look at this tree and knowing that it can produce over 80 liters of sap, how many liters of maple syrup do you think we can get from 80 liters of sap? I think we've talked a little bit about this already in the other presentations. Knowing that has really low sugar content, do you think we can get 1 liter of sap, 2 liters of sap, 10, or even 20 liters? Let me know what you think. All right, so lots of votes. We're unsure, but most of the audience is saying 2 liters of sap. And if things go well, that is certainly what you can get. 80 liters of sap will make about 2 liters of syrup, or about 2 of these bottles, because we have that 40-to-1 ratio of sap to syrup. So of course, it's so much work to really boil down that sap. And so let's take a look at boiling down the sap a little bit more. And so today, the boiling down happens in the sugar shack, and most small maple producers today are still using pails for collecting sap, but larger sugar bushes are using plastic tubing, like we can see here pictured in that bottom left, where those tubes are actually directly attached to the spile in the tree and moving sap to a central storage tank to feed the evaporator. And these systems can work on gravity if there's a nice slope in the forest, or they can actually use a vacuum pump system. And then the sap gets boiled down. So here we see pictured the wood burning evaporator that can turn sap into maple syrup in about 3 to 5 hours on a good day. And so you can, hopefully next year you can visit the Maple Syrup Festival at the Corate Center or Bruce's Mill and see some of this in action. And so that maple syrup gets boiled down into pure Canadian maple syrup that is graded by color. All of these syrup grades are identical in their density and sugar content, about 66.5% to be considered pure maple syrup. But the color of the syrup really ranges from pale gold to the dark brown. And the color has to do with when in the season it was produced. So at the beginning of the season, we have a lot more sap with higher flow and a higher sugar content. Can be as high as 10% sugar and 90% water. And so this means that the sap requires less boiling time to reach that required 66% sugar content. So with a shorter boiling time, the syrup finishes off a lighter color. Whereas at the end of the season, when the sap has a much lower sugar content, even as low as 1.5%, the sap needs to be boiled down much longer to be able to get to that sugar content. So it darkens as it boils. And so later in the season, we get that dark amber maple syrup. And the grades end up having different flavors and are preferred for different recipes. We've talked about some of those uses already today. And so, of course, you can buy, as mentioned in the resource section and already today, that you can buy some pure maple syrup from the Courtright Center if you'd like, and those proceeds will support education programs. And so if you'd like to learn more about making maple syrup at home, we have a fun video that you can watch in the Activity and Resource Center on the Virtual Maple Syrup Festival today. And you can follow along as Molly collects sap from sugar maple trees and boils it down at home into one of spring's sweet treats. So you can check that out to really see how the magic happens. And lastly, just before I end here, I just want to mention that we'd love for you to join us again. We have lots of virtual programs coming up, family programs just like today. You can also join our Virtual Maple Syrup Festival with your class. So we're offering school programs through the Courtright Center. And also we have registration opening soon for our in-person summer nature camp so that you can actually get out in the forest with us. So check out our page to join us again. And so that's it for my presentation. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
Thanks a million, Leanna. That is really amazing. I actually thought I knew a little bit about this stuff, but there were a whole bunch of points that in that presentation that I did not know. So thank you very much for the presentation and for all that information. So we do have some questions. One of the questions that came in is a good one. Besides maple and birch trees, are there other trees that can be tapped and a syrup made from their sap?
Yeah, I think you can experiment with different tree types for sure. I mean, this is a naturally occurring substance. I'm not familiar with any trees that would have sap that could be bad for you. So I don't know if I should just blanket say that it's fine to try with any tree, but I think they'll have different flavors. And I think through experimentation, we have found that sugar maples and birch maple sap tastes really good, has great nutritional value in both of those, different flavor profiles. So I imagine there's some that probably doesn't taste very good for other tree species.
Yeah, as we did talk a little bit earlier about birch syrup, and it's my understanding that it's much darker. It's much, I think it's 100 to 1 as opposed to 40 to 1. So it doesn't taste as sweet or maple. Well, it certainly doesn't taste mapley, but yeah, that's an interesting question. So does it matter, another question, does it matter where you put the buckets on the tree? I mean, is higher up, lower down? I mean, does it make any difference at all?
Yeah, I know, it's about 3 feet from the ground that is the common area for it. And that could be probably, it started off as ease of use, right? That was the easiest place to reach. But I think it also has to do with the pressure and the way that sap is flowing in the tree. We think about how large that tree is and the pressure system that's happening to draw the sap up to the buds and then be replaced from the roots. I think that is part of it as well. But I don't know the exact science behind it. I think even some of the pressure gradients are still a bit of a mystery to humans. It's a really amazing process.
I've heard that too, that there's, as much as we know now about maple syrup production, there's still a lot of science actually that goes on in experimenting with things. We probably still don't understand all there is to know about maple syrup and maple sap. So I get asked this quite a bit, where do you buy maple syrup? And I know there's a bit of confusion sometimes when you go to the grocery store and, there's brands that they're not pure Canadian maple syrup. They're something that tastes a little bit like it, but it isn't. And I know that we saw a shop in Richmond Hill, and there are a couple of grocery stores in Richmond Hill that do sell pure maple syrup. But I also wanted to give a shout out to TRCA. I know you guys are selling pure maple syrup. I mean, it's made right there at either Bruce's Mill or at Courtright. And there is a link on our website that says how you can get that ordered. Leanna, do you want to add anything to that?
I will say that although we are collecting sap in our sugar bushes, those are really for demonstration purposes. So we are not selling that maple syrup directly, but we are locally sourcing it from nearby in Formosa, from a local maple syrup producer, a small operation, and it certainly is pure maple syrup.
Right, just to the north of us then. That's great. I also should mention that the video that you had referenced with Molly from the TRCA, the link to that, I think I shared on social media. I think we also put that on our website as well. So, you know, that people can take a look. It's actually a great video, and it's really good for people that want to do a little bit of hobby maple syrup making too. So that is available on our website as well. So does it, people, I've also heard this from others, and then we got a question here too. Does it hurt the tree to be tapping it year after year, so long as you're not tapping more than you should based on the size of the tree?
Yeah, so I mean, you're certainly drilling into the tree, creating a wound that the tree will then have to heal over. And so although they are able to heal over those wounds as you tap it year after year, there is kind of a lifespan for tapping. And so you shouldn't you shouldn't tap for many years. After a certain point, you can kind of retire those trees, and sugar maple producers kind of know what is the best practice for really managing a healthy forest so that it can be sustainable and be a renewable resource.
Right. And that's a very interesting thing about maple syrup production, is that if done properly, it is a very renewable and sustainable resource. The question that came in is, can you comment on whether people would be able to actually tap trees in their yard? I mean, you've helped us to identify the different kinds of maple trees, and really it's sugar maple trees that are the ideal ones to tap. Do you have any thoughts on that, and what the implications of maybe tapping a tree or two?
Yeah, so I mentioned that a tree is kind of ready to tap when it's about the size of a dinner plate. So that's when the tree is making ample sap and kind of more than it really needs to really grow to its mature size. So if you have a tree in your front or backyard, you can certainly look at tapping it. It's always good to give trees as much love and care as you can. So removing grass maybe from or ground cover from below the tree that it might be competing with, using mulch below it to really take care of it. And so, if you're taking care of your tree, I think you certainly can tap it. It's an exciting thing to do this time of year to, really connect with the land. And that can be different species of maples. I've even heard that you can tap Norway maples, even though they have that milky sap. So you can experiment with that. That may be the most common tree that you have in your yard. But I would kind of discourage folks from visiting natural areas to tap trees because they're often, under enough pressure already. With the urban areas nearby.
Right. Yeah. Good point. So you had mentioned earlier another question that came in about different grades of maple syrup. I've always been interested in that. Is there a difference in taste or quality or whatever from the different the grades of syrup, all the way from really, really light syrup all the way to very dark syrup?
Yeah, as I understand it, I think the different tastes are really for a preference and kind of have different applications. So the lighter colored, the golden sap has a more delicate taste, that still that maple flavor, but maybe you want to put it on maybe for more lighter application, where the darker maple sap has a much stronger taste. And I think that, the common maple syrup for your pancakes is kind of the in between. But the flavor certainly does change.
What is your preference?
I don't think I've actually tried all of them in different meals. It's just kind of what I understand. So I think I just like the medium maple syrup pancake, which I had, this morning before our presentation to really get in the mood.
Maybe that's an activity for TRCA in the future, is to do maple syrup tasting. We could all get dressed up in our fancy clothes and have a gala and do that at some point. I'll certainly be there if you decide to do that.
It's a great idea.
Yeah. Actually, question here, is climate change affecting the production of maple syrup? I.e. the timing and collection and so on. That's actually an interesting question.
That's a great question. We're experiencing climate change, which is really defined as, the long-term change in our weather patterns. So we're seeing more extreme temperatures, more warm days, more extreme cold days, more rain and snow, stronger winds, and this has a lot of impacts on the forest. I'm sure you can think about branches breaking more easily from ice storms, which sap could be dripping from, and maybe the trees could be losing more sap. There's a lot of impacts directly to the forest, which will likely impact maple syrup production. We can even think of, having earlier springs that can be, false springs, and buds could potentially be fooled into bursting and bursting too soon. And as soon as we have another frost, they could then freeze and then be injured. So sorry, I'm kind of, there's a lot of different things to think about: the trees individually, the forest as a whole, and then also the sugaring season could be shorter if we have warmer days where we don't have those cold nights. Then the maple syrup season will just kind of end, because the sap is going to go straight to the buds even sooner. So climate change is something that we're experiencing, and we're still I guess trying to figure out what those implications will be on the sugaring industry, but certainly impacts the forest.
Yeah, very interesting. I guess there's also, Richmond Hill recently passed an urban forest management plan, and it was actually a very interesting report. And they talk about a number of threats to the forest in general, not just maple trees, including invasive species, which you touched on earlier in your presentation, more extreme weather events and so on. So, I think there are lots of the same types of impacts that would happen in any forest probably will be affecting maple syrup production, at some point. So I actually had a question here, and I suppose this is probably for me. The question was, where are the best places in Richmond Hill to go see maple trees? That's a question that's dear to my heart. And by the way, we do have a contest going on that if you do a selfie with a maple tree, you could get yourself a sweet prize. I do have an opinion on that. My favorite places in Ward 4, at least, are Pioneer Park, which is the park that's behind the Mackenzie Health Hospital. There are some really big trees in there, both oak trees and also maple trees. And if you wanted to go out for a walk, if you lived in the Mill Pond area, that would be a great place to go. If you live kind of in the middle of the ward around Canyon Hill and Bathurst, we have a fantastic forest in there attached to Twickenham Park beside the Elgin West Community Center. And that's actually the forest that we usually have our Maple Syrup Festival in. Some of the biggest maple and oak trees I've ever seen are in that forest. And then I think my third favorite place, if you go up to Tower Hill between Yonge Street and Bathurst and park in the Autumn Grove Park parking lot, you go cut through the Autumn Grove Park to the Sagen Trail extension north. There's an absolutely lovely bush lot north in that trail that goes all the way over to Jefferson Side Road, and some just enormous, beautiful examples of maple. It's a real mature hardwood forest in there with lots of big trees and almost no understory. So it really is a beautiful place. And given the temperature today, I would very strongly encourage people to get out and go for a walk and give a maple tree a hug. Actually, one other question. Actually, I've got a couple more here. How many years would be the lifespan of a maple tree, and how long could you maybe tap it once it becomes big enough to tap?
I don't really do our maple programs at our education centers, so I'm not really sure with that lifespan about what is kind of really appropriate and best for those trees. So I'd have to look into that and get back to you, unfortunately.
No, that's okay. We've certainly, there's some very big maple trees on our website. There's they think that the largest maple tree in Ontario is called the Comfort Maple. It's down in the Niagara area, and it's hundreds of years old. So I guess, under the right conditions, they can grow for a very long time. And I would assume you could probably tap them for quite a span. There is a question here about when the labels on the maple syrup read pure, quote unquote, maple syrup, is it more marketing or is it actually related to the process?
I mean, you know, the real guidelines to be considered pure maple syrup is that sugar content. And there's really very few additives or no additives really to maple syrup. So I'm pretty sure that's the designation, the pure maple syrup for what we find. As you mentioned, you know, there's lots of other pancake syrup on the market, corn syrup and other things that have no maple sap in them. So yeah, that pure maple syrup should be what we're looking for.
Yeah, I think there's actually an association or an organization that regulates maple syrup production, and I think that term means that, you know, they're complying with the purity of the product as well, which is kind of what you were saying, I think. So, okay, let me just see here. Might be one more here. Okay, I think that's it. Andrew, do we have any other questions at this time for Leanna?
Nope, that's it. They're all submitted and answered.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Leanna. And again, thank you to yourself and to the TRCA. And, you know, I have to say that there's so many people that you know, growing up in this area my whole life, there's so many times that I've been able to go to, you know, see the maple syrup being made in person at, you know, the Courtright Center or at Bruce's Mill. And I mean, unfortunately, that, you know, that's a bit problematic, although you say that you've got some virtual programs for school kids, which would be great. But I got to say it is great to be able to go there. And it's a thing that you can do with your families year after year. You know, take a walk in the bush at Courtright and then go, you know, actually smell that steam coming off the evaporator and the smell of the sugar shack. There's just nothing like it. So, but we certainly appreciate your presentation today, because during a pandemic, I absolutely think this is the best that we can have at the moment. And we really thank you for that. So let me just see here. I think we have one last poll before we wind down the festival and send it back over to Elder Wabigoon for our closing. So Andrew, can we launch that poll at this time? Okay, so the question is, when is sugaring season? Late March to early June, when the temperatures are above zero, or January to February when the temperatures are below zero all the time, or early spring when the days are above zero and the nights are below zero? It looks like we've got a lot of people that were listening carefully to Leanna's presentation. Okay, let's close the poll, Andrew, and let's take a look at the results. So the answer is early spring when the days are above zero and the nights are below zero, and that was 90% of our respondents got that. So congratulations, that's great. All right. Let me see here. So I think at this point, I'd like to put it back over to Elder Wabigoon. So as we prepare to wrap up our 5th annual Maple Syrup Festival, I'd like to invite Elder Wabigoon to lead us in a closing ceremony. And we'll make a few brief comments after Elder Wabigoon's presentation. But at this point, I would say Chi Miigwech to you, Elder Wabigoon, and pass it back over to you.
Miigwech, David, miigwech, miigwech. Wow, what a learning 2 hours that was. And miigwech to all the presenters. You know, we just keep on learning, and the more we learn, miigwech.
Thank you, Elder Wabigoon, and miigwech, Chi Miigwech to you too, and thank you for all that you have done for us today. We very much appreciate it. You know, there's so many things that we've heard today, actually, that are very interesting, I think. And, you know, one of the things just in closing out here that I've always found interesting is, you know, spring is such an important part to just humanity. You know, anywhere you go where there is a spring season, it's a time of renewal and it's a time of celebration, you know, at least in the Northern Hemisphere after what can be a very long winter. And I know that, you know, many cultures celebrate spring in various different forms. I know we're right now in Nowruz, so Nowruz Mubarak for anybody that's celebrating Nowruz, and you know, Passover and Easter are 2 others that are coming up fairly soon. And there's so many other spring celebrations that happen. And today we've learned that the Anishinaabe people actually do celebrate this time as well as a new year. So thank you, and Miigwech, Elder Wabagoon, for all that you've brought to us. I do have a number of other thank yous to give as well. I would like to start off thanking Andrew and Kate and Susan, who played a huge part in helping to put this on today. We certainly have learned a lot about Zoom and the type of virtual meetings, which we never knew a year ago we would understand. I'd also like to thank the Citizen Committee that we've always had, and many of the members on that committee have been with us since the very beginning in helping us to put this together. So thank you to all of you. I'd like to thank our singers, Jay and Michael, and you're going to be hearing more from them in a minute to take us out. And as we said earlier, but I think it bears repeating, thank you to the TRCA and all the great work that you do, and for being such a willing partner to today, and providing so much of your understanding and wisdom in maple syrup and the natural environment in general. And also to the Richmond Hill Historical Society for your longstanding partnership with this event as well. And again, I'd like to thank our sponsors, JKO Planning Services, JG Cordoni Investment Limited, and Garden Homes. So I will say that before Jay and Michael play us out toward the end of this day today, I'd like to just two reminders, and Elder Wabagoon said this as well. I would certainly invite you with such a lovely day that it is today to get out there and go for a walk in your favorite forest. And I also hope that in 2022 in March, if you can save the date, we'll certainly be trying to have a back live and in person Richmond Hill Ward 4 Maple Syrup Festival, and we certainly hope that you can join us for that. So I'll pass it back over to you, Andrew, and I guess you will do a little bit of housekeeping, and we'll take it out with some great music. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Councillor West, and thank you everyone for attending and participating this morning. A few notes before we wrap up. If you could just please help us in planning and executing future events by completing an exit survey. And as mentioned, please visit Councillor West's website post-event at David-West-Richmond Hill /Maple Syrup Festival for additional activities and resources. And as it was mentioned a few times this morning, take advantage of the beautiful weather. Head to Richmond Hill Forest or Trail, and we want to see those selfies with the sugar maple tree. And the contest will be open until next Sunday, which is Sunday, March the 28th. And as Councillor West mentioned, we hope to see you guys again in person in 2022. And in a moment here, I will pull on a video from Jay and Michael to close us out. So thank you guys again, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Well, howdy folks. Jay and I are pleased as punch to be playing for the Richmond Hill Maple Syrup Festival. And we're up here in the woods of Central Ontario, and we're going to play a little bit of traditional music for you.
Mazurkas. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2.